There's a little ROI for you.
So how does that make you feel when actually someone comes up to you after a show and actually relates to what you're actually saying to them, and they have that feeling where they're not alone anymore?
Oh, it's extremely therapeutic for me. It's happened over and over. Every time I keynote, Brody, I set aside half hour, 60 minutes. I tell them, look, we're going to do some general Q&A. And if you've got a question or a story you want to share or whatever you don't want to share in front of everybody else, I'll hang out until we've all talked individually. And sometimes there are 2 people, and sometimes there are 10 that want to talk. So because what happens when I speak and I'm vulnerable, guys don't normally talk about these kind of things. So for a guy to go up and say, I'm nuttier than a squirrel turd, it allows other people to give voice to their feelings and experiences without worrying about recrimination. So most of the conversations start like this, Brody. I've never told anybody this. Well, I get that a lot because they know that I get it, not at an academic level, it's a visceral level. We hear the same music. We've been through the same situations. So if you watch my audience when I start talking, and I get to the part about the gun in my mouth, you can see the mentally ill people, a quarter of the people in the room, generally 25%, lean forward, thinking, oh man, the guy gets it. And you can see the neurotypicals lean back, oh dear God, a gun in his mouth? So and I speak for both groups. I speak to the mentally ill, very relatable, and I speak to the neurotypical and try to decode for them what's going on in the mind of somebody who is living with mental illness. I give a metaphor, analogy. I can't remember. There's a Greek god named Sisyphus, and Sisyphus gave fire to man. That was his big crime. And so Zeus sentenced him to roll a rock up a hill every day, and the idea was if he could get the rock over the top of the hill, he could retire. But as luck would have it, every time he got the rock near the top of the hill, it'd roll back down to the bottom. I tell the neurotypical folks, that's what mental illness is like. Every morning when you wake up, there's a rock in the hill. Some days the rock is small, the hill's not so steep. Some days the rock is a boulder, and the hill is Kilimanjaro. But every day, without fail, there's a rock in the hill. And my job is, for anybody who hears my voice, the sound of my voice, when they wake up the next morning, I want them to be able to move that rock. So I do some of my talk for the people who live with mental illness and some for people who care about them and have no idea, can't figure out what's going on.
So when you're doing these shows and you're making these jokes about suicide and depression, do you get obviously you're relating to the people that do have mental illness, but what about the percentage of people that might take offense to the things that you actually say, some of your jokes? Do you get that often?
No, as a matter of fact, because here's the thing about comedy, Brody. In comedy, you can joke about any group to which you belong. So I have 2 mental illnesses. I can joke about people with mental illness. I've had a gun in my mouth, so I can joke about suicide. And I really don't tell jokes. Let me give you an example. I tell funny stories from anecdotes. I'm doing a keynote. I mentioned that I put a gun in my mouth. I didn't pull the trigger. And a friend of mine was there. And he comes up afterwards. He goes, hey, man, how come you didn't pull the trigger? I said, hey, man, could you try to sound slightly less disappointed? That's the kind of thing. No, not really jokes. A guy called the other day, Brody. He says to me, I'm sorry I'm calling you late. I didn't mean to leave you hanging. I let that, and then said, do you want to rephrase that? Oh, my God. Oh, my God. Yeah, and what I'm attempting to do there, Brody, is to reduce the stigma. Because people have an idea what mental illness looks and sounds like. And they're sitting there in the audience looking at me, wrote jokes for Jay Leno for 20 years, been doing stand-up comedy full-time for 35, obviously got my whatever together, at least outwardly it would appear. And so it's like cognitive dissonance. They can't hold what they formerly believed mental illness looked and sounded like in the same brain with what they're observing on stage at that moment. So it helps to reduce the stigma and so forth, to see me up there doing that.
Let's go back. Let's talk about when you had the gun in your mouth and you didn't pull the trigger. What stopped you from pulling the trigger?
I was just practicing, see if I could do it. I put the gun in my mouth and pulled the hammer back. And it was loaded with what they call federal hydroshock hollow points. So if I'd pull the trigger, there's no coming back. 3 times as many women attempt suicide as men. Men tend to complete more often because they use a firearm. I knew when I put the gun in my mouth, Brody, that I had a life insurance policy that was $1 million. That's why I put the gun in my mouth. I believed I was a burden to my wife and I could fix that. It's called burdensomeness. A lot of people who die by suicide firmly believe, the world would be better off without them. irrational, but that's what they believe. That's what I believe. But I knew, having sold insurance right out of college, that my policy had a 2-year suicide clause, which meant if I pull the trigger before 24 months have elapsed, nothing. My wife gets the premiums back. If I pull the trigger at 24 months and a day, she gets $1 million. So I call my insurance agent, and we're chit-chatting away. And hey, man, how long have I had that policy? He goes, I don't know. So I'll check. I can hear him clacking on the keys on the computer. He comes back on, then it hits him. I'm not calling, he realizes, to find out when the policy is fully in effect. I'm calling for permission to kill myself. So he goes, don't do it. It's 22 months. You've had it 22 months, and don't do it. So I had to wait 2 months to kill myself, Brody. So my life insurance policy actually saved my life because I couldn't pull the trigger. I couldn't leave my wife brokenhearted and broke.
So what happens when you got to 24 months and 1 day?
You know, I wasn't marking them off the calendar. I don't recall. I think what happened was things got a little bit better. The bankruptcy went through. The harassing phone calls from the creditors stopped. And maybe acceptance set in. Okay, we filed Chapter 7. We've lost everything. We got to move on. And so it was like fighting the tide, moving on, but we did. That was 12 years ago. And we began our recovery. And my wife stuck with me. A lot of times a bankruptcy will blow up a marriage, or either blow it up, Brody, or drive you closer together. And so it drove us closer together. And so she had to go to work full time because she'd been my chief of staff as a speaker and comedian. She had to go to work full time because we had to have health insurance. In the United States, somebody's got to have a real job in health insurance. Yep. And she's done that for the last 12 years. She's getting ready to go to part-time September 1st. We're gonna ride Cobra, which is the replacement if you leave your full-time job to keep your insurance. We're going to ride Cobra for 5 months until she qualifies for Medicare. Then she doesn't have to work at all if she doesn't want to. And she'll be my chief of staff again, and I'll never cut the grass again, Brody. Can't wait.
That's awesome. So you're writing jokes for Jay Leno for the earlier part of your career. What made you decide I'm going to be a comedian in the mental health space? You could have gone any direction. You could have been a Seinfeld, or you could have been Dave Chappelle. What made you do this?
I had a number of keynotes, funny keynotes. I have a networking keynote. I've had 2 aortic valve replacements, a double bypass, a heart attack, and 3 stents. I have 25 minutes of cardio comedy. I have a motivational, inspirational speech. But I wasn't really pushing those. What happened was, after the recession, Brody, when speaker bookings came back, because they dropped off about 80% during the recession, when they came back, the meeting planner said to me, Frank, listen, we can't pay you $5,000 anymore just to be funny for 45 minutes. You got to teach the audience something. I'm like, what am I going to teach them? I got a book from a friend of mine named Judy Carter. Judy Carter. If you're listening to this and you want to be a speaker and you want to know what story you should tell, get Judy Carter's book. It's called The Message of You, Turning Your Life into a Money-Making Speaking Career. Man, talk about a specific subtitle. So I went into the book, Brody, thinking I got nothing. And then halfway through, I thought, oh, my gosh, I've got a story. You know, my family's crazy. I'm crazy. I came close to killing myself. If I got some training and certifications in suicide prevention, I could keynote on that. So I did. I got several certifications in suicide prevention training. And then I realized in the speaking business, they say you need to pick a lane. So I picked the lane of suicide prevention speaking. I still would do a motivational speech if somebody wanted it and wanted to pay me for it, but I don't market it. I just have it. I was going to only market suicide prevention. And what I tell my speaker coaching clients is you need to figure out who your ideal client is. And my ideal client is somebody who has an annual meeting, which screams association. They got people coming to the meetings. They got money. They can pay your fee. They use outside speakers like me. And here's the number one. It's the linchpin, Brody. They have a desperate need to hear what you have to say. So I selected 6 of the top 10 at-risk occupations for suicide. Dentists, veterinarians, physicians, attorneys, agriculture, and construction, by the way, is the number 1 at-risk occupation for suicide. 1,000 people die every year by accident in construction. Roughly 5,000 die by suicide in construction every year. That means you're 5 times more likely to jump off the building than fall off it.